Pray with me. Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to remind us of why we are here and exactly what you have fashioned us for. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Today I want to share with you a piece of great poetic literature. I understand that as I recite this, that it may touch your heart. You may be moved emotionally. You may tear up a little bit. It may mess with your soul. It is a classic piece of literature. We don't know who wrote it or when it was written, but I only hope that today I can do it justice. So here it is. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the Lord was passing by, he looked up in that tree and he said, "Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today, for I'm going to your house today." Zacchaeus was a wee little man, but a happy man was he, for he had seen the Lord that day. And a happy man was he, a very happy man was he. I know, you need a minute to kind of compose yourself, because that is such a profound piece of classic literature. But don't underestimate it. I realize that I could not really do it justice, but don't think too lightly of that children's song, because that song and that story of a man named Zacchaeus is a path for us to understand the Tao, to understand our true nature, who we really are. It is, in fact, more profound than we realize. It is an introduction into the Tao of generosity. A week and a half ago, I went to North Carolina to visit my parents. And there are a lot of reasons why I go to see my parents. I really like to spend time with them. It's important for me to go and visit with them. My father is 93, my mother is 87. They moved from our farm in Pennsylvania to North Carolina to be close to my sister, and I try and get out there as often as I can. And when I think about why do I go to visit my parents, my chief motivation is I want to spend time with them. I realize it means a great deal to them to have their children come and spend time with them at this season in their life, and I want to do that for them. But I also realize that there are some motives in me that aren't exactly pure, that my motivation for going to see my parents is not exactly pristine. Every time I go to see them, I am reminded of what a terrible child I was. I was the worst. I was awful. I was stiff-necked and rebellious. I was cantankerous. I was moody. I was difficult. I was argumentative. I got slapped in the face and spanked on the butt and sent to my room and had my mouth washed out with soap and castor oil more times than I can remember. I was the classic strong-willed child. Are any of you raising strong-willed children? God bless you. Do not grow weary in your well-doing, and do not commit murder. But I was a terrible child. I would talk back to my parents. I would argue with them all the time. I was mean to my sister. I consistently actually beat up my brother on a regular basis. I complained about everything, and I pressed my parents to the point where, on more than one occasion, many occasions, they would say to me, well, if that's going to be your attitude, if you can't do this without complaining, well, then don't do it at all. To which I would say, good, I didn't want to do that anyway. Thanks a lot. But what they were trying to teach me, what they desperately wanted me to learn, was that my attitude mattered. Sometimes why we do things and the attitude we carry into those things and the motivation for those things are as important as what we do. They were trying to teach me the importance of pure motives and a good attitude. Sound familiar? Were any of you taught those lessons about motivation and attitude? Why we do things is perhaps as important, if not more important, than what we actually do? I think most of us learned those lessons. Those are good lessons, but I want to challenge them today. I want to challenge them because of the Tao. A few weeks ago, we began a conversation about the Tao of Jesus, and I suggested that the Tao is that thing that holds the whole universe together. The Tao explains the way life works, and Jesus said, I am the Tao. And the way of Jesus we've been looking at, we talked about the Tao of mercy, and we talked about the Tao of purity. And last week, Lee Congdon. Didn't Lee Congdon do an amazing job last Sunday? I have to tell you, I am a man most blessed to have a team of professional ministers and staff who are the best I have ever worked with. And hopefully you got a sense of the gifting that is in people like Casey and like Lee and so many of our staff members. But Lee talked about last week about the Tao of humility. And today, I want us to conclude our conversation, our adventure, our journey into the Tao of Jesus by talking about the ambiguous Tao of generosity. You see, the motivation for generosity is one that is difficult to discern, and yet it is part of the Tao. You see, the Tao is a thing that doesn't care whether we like it or not. The Tao is like gravity. Gravity doesn't care whether you believe in gravity. Gravity doesn't care whether you feel like having gravity today. Gravity just is. There are things in life that are true whether or not we feel like they're true or whether or not we like them to be true. They're still true. The earth was round even when everyone thought it was flat. Bacteria still made people sick even before they discovered what a bacteria was through a single lens microscope. These things exist, and the Tao exists in spite of our understanding or affection for it. And the Tao of generosity is the right thing even when we don't feel like being generous. Even when our motives are ambiguous. And the story of Zacchaeus is the story of the paradox of the Tao of generosity. The story of Zacchaeus is told to us in the 19th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. It tells us in chapter 19 of Luke that Jesus made his way to the city of Jericho. Now, we don't know if Jesus had ever been to Jericho before. He had spent most of his public ministry, most of his adult ministry, in the northern region of Israel, up in the area of Galilee. He had ventured down to Jerusalem at least one or two times, but as far as we know, he had never been to the city of Jericho before. But Jericho had existed for at least 11,000 years before the time of Christ. According to archaeologists, the city of Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited cities on the earth. There is archaeological evidence that people have been living on the same site in the Jordan River Valley that is called Jericho for 13,000 years. Jesus went to the city of Jericho because he was making his way up to Jerusalem. What most of the people who were with him did not understand was that he was literally in the final days of his life. He was making his final trip out of the Jordan River Valley up to the city of Jericho. Jericho was famous in the Jewish culture because 1,400 years before the time of Christ, it stood as the obstacle to the people of God entering into the promised land. I think we all remember the story of Joshua and the people of Israel crossing the Jordan River, and then the fortress of Jericho stood in front of them. And so they mounted a siege campaign, and the siege campaign amounted to them walking around it once a day for 7 days. And on the seventh day, they walked around it 7 times, and they blew the trumpets, and as they did, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. In Jesus' day, the city of Jericho was a resort community. It was a vacation spot. Because it was a temperate climate, it was literally an oasis in the desert there in the Jordan River Valley. Many of the wealthy and influential people of Jerusalem would travel to Jericho, and they had second homes or vacation homes there. In fact, King Herod built a winter palace in Jericho. You see, Jericho exists at 825 feet below sea level. Jerusalem, just 18 miles away, exists at 2,500 feet above sea level. So you could be in the snow and the rain in Jerusalem and walk the 18 miles to Jericho and be in an arid summer-like climate. But the walk from Jericho to Jerusalem, the climb up almost 3/4 of a mile over an 18-mile journey, was through the Judean wilderness. And the Judean wilderness harbored many highwaymen and robbers. The story of the Good Samaritan takes place on the road to Jericho. And so the wealthy and the religious of Jerusalem found themselves living in the city of Jericho. And as Jesus entered in, Jesus was trending big time in Israel. It's not an exaggeration to imagine that as Jesus came into Jericho, that the shops closed down for the day, and the fields were empty, and the homes were abandoned, because these people wanted to see this young rabbi who had been healing and working miracles and teaching radical things for the last 2.5 years. And as the crowds gathered, it tells us that there was a man named Zacchaeus who wanted to see him. Now, we know a few things about Zacchaeus. We know that Zacchaeus was a tax collector, which meant that Zacchaeus was a man without a country. He was despised by his fellow Jews because they saw him as a traitor to their nation, as a man who paid homage to their Roman overlords, who for the sake of financial gain betrayed his country and his people. The average citizen saw Zacchaeus as a person to be despised because he was a tax collector, and he shook them down for his own profit. The Romans even despised him, first of all because he wasn't a Roman, but secondly because they saw him as a liar and a cheat. He was a man without a country. He was a tax collector, much like Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, the Levi, son of Alphaeus. But he wasn't just a tax collector, he was the chief regional tax collector, which meant that all of the monies that were collected by all of the other tax collectors in all of the other cities in Judea, a part of that would stick to him on its way to Rome. And so it says that he had become very wealthy. What would you say is very wealthy? I would say, if you want to impress me with your wealth, tell me you're worth $100 million. I would say, well, that's very wealthy. I don't know about you, but I could get by on $100 million. Well, he was very wealthy. Let's imagine that he was worth $100 million. But there's one other thing that we know about Zacchaeus. We know that he was a wee little man. We know that he was very short. When I think of who Zacchaeus is, I often think of the actor Danny DeVito. You know who Danny DeVito is? I imagine that if we were doing a film about the life of Zacchaeus, we would cast Danny DeVito as Zacchaeus. It'd just be perfect for that role. But he couldn't see over the crowd because of he was challenged in his altitude. And he decides to climb up into a sycamore tree just to get a look at this passing young rabbi. And we don't know why he climbed up in that tree. I mean, it must have been embarrassing. I mean, imagine a man dressed in a fine suit, a custom-made, multi-thousand-dollar suit, a man who was concerned about presenting himself as wealthy and successful, climbing up into a sycamore tree, a Ficus sycamoris. They populate the Jordan River Valley. Sometimes they can grow to be 5 or 6 feet in diameter. They can grow as tall as 60 feet and have a girth of over 100 feet. And here is this wealthy businessman, dressed in all of his finery, climbing up into this tree. We don't know why he didn't just hire somebody to hold him on his shoulders, or hire an entourage of people to push through the crowd, exert his influence and his wealth if he really wanted to meet this young rabbi. But he humbles himself. He climbs up in the tree, maybe hoping that he would be noticed. Maybe hoping that somehow he would have an interaction with this rabbi. Maybe it was just sycophantic and he just wanted to see him. We don't know. In fact, the story of Zacchaeus probably could have been told thousands of times. I'm sure that in the midst of Jesus' wild popularity, that there were stories of people who leaned off of rooftops and climbed up walls and pressed their way through crowds just to get a glimpse of him. And Zacchaeus would have faded into the obscurity of those thousands and thousands of other stories were it not for what happens next. Because what happens next is that Jesus sees him. And he just doesn't see him in that tree. He calls him by name. Now, we don't know exactly how he knew who Zacharias was. It's not like it was Matthew McConaughey up in the tree. And you say, oh, I know that guy. Now, it's possible that his disciple Matthew, Levi the son of Alphaeus, who had been a tax collector, who would have known who the regional tax collector was, said, oh, look at that. That's the regional tax collector, Zacchaeus. Look at him, he's hanging from a branch. That's hilarious. What I like to believe is that Jesus calls him by name because he knew him before he got there. He knew Zacchaeus before Zacchaeus was born, that he came to Jericho to meet him. And he sees him up in the tree and he calls him by name. He doesn't ask, why are you up there? What are you doing? What do you hope to gain by climbing up in that tree? He says, no, Zacchaeus, come down, because I'm inviting myself and my entourage to your home today. We don't know why Zacchaeus was on that branch looking at Jesus, but we know how he reacted. When he came down from the tree, he was filled with joy. It's possible that he was filled with joy because he imagined that now he would have the friend of this young rabbi, that he would have the approval of his peers, that the people who despised him would have to look at him differently because now he had a friend who was this famous radical rabbi. He had been in his home, and he thought maybe his reputation would be redeemed simply by association. We understand how that works, don't we? We know that when we hang out with people of influence, we actually have access to more influence. When we hang out with people of wealth, we realize that some of that capacity, some of those opportunities come to us. And maybe he thought, my reputation will be redeemed just by my association with this young rabbi. We know that's what the religious leaders thought, because they harumphed and said, oh, no. You can't associate with him. He's the worst of the worst. Why would this young rabbi associate with such a despised, despicable man? It says that when they got to this place, his home, and they were having a dinner at some point, Zacchaeus stands up. And he announces to Jesus and his entourage, his disciples, and to all of the disreputable friends that he must have invited to that meal, he stands up and he says, I am going to give half of my wealth to the poor. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine someone at a dinner party standing up and saying, I today am pledging to give away $50 million? That would get your attention. You'd be going, oh, that's very generous of you. Why are you doing that? What are you up to? What's the game you're running here? What's going on? Why are you giving away half of your wealth? And then he says, I'm not only just going to give away half of my wealth, I'm going to repay everyone who I have cheated, which is everyone. I'm going to repay all those who I have cheated fourfold. Now, he was negotiating when he was doing that because the law required that he repay sevenfold. So he's probably saying, well, four's pretty good. It's not quite seven, but it's better than half, So I'll give it. He may have, in that moment, promised publicly to be generous with 3/4 of his wealth. He may have literally stood up and said, I'm going to give away $75 million. Why? Why did he do it? Did he think that by being generous, he would gain the favor of this young rabbi? Did he think that he would reestablish his reputation? Why are we generous? Why? Do we think that it benefits us? Do we think it's what we're supposed to do? I was thinking about this, and all of these reasons came to mind. In fact, it was very easy for me to put together a list of 10 reasons why Zacchaeus could have been generous, 10 reasons why we can be generous. See if any of these sound familiar. We are generous because we have been blessed. I think that's a good thing. Why are we generous? Number 2, because we're thankful. Why are we generous? Number 3, because we can meet a need. We can meet someone's need. I'm going to be generous because I can help with that. Number 4, sometimes we're generous because we realize we have more than we need. We have 2 and we can give 1 away. We have too much. We have more than we can ever use. Number 5, we're generous because we're supposed to be. Number 6, we're generous because we're ordered to as a part of a plea bargain. So we're responsible to. Number 7, we're generous because we feel guilty. Number 8, because through our generosity, people will think highly of us. It will make people like us. Number 9, we're generous because we can get something in return. Number 10, we're generous because we believe that generosity is better than greed. You could probably add 10 things to that list right now. There are probably countless reasons why we are generous. Why was Zacchaeus generous? We don't know. We don't know whether he was motivated by gratitude. We don't know whether he was motivated by greed. We like to think, we like to imagine that he was motivated because of the generosity of the Savior shown to him, that he became generous because his life was transformed, like Ebenezer Scrooge. You remember the story of the Christmas Carol? We know why he was generous. We know why he bought Tiny Tim and his family the biggest turkey. It was because his life was turned upside down. He realized that his life was on a path of destruction. And so in order to change his life, because he had realized this, we understand why he was generous. We don't know about Zacchaeus. We don't know why he was generous. And we don't need to. We do know what Jesus said about it. Jesus responds as he pledges to give away perhaps 75% of his wealth. He says, salvation has come to this house today, for this is truly a son of Abraham. Now, the grammar here is ambiguous. The grammar here is unclear. He may be saying that the reason salvation came to this house today was because he was generous. That salvation came because of his generosity. It could also mean that because salvation came, he now is generous. That he is not giving to get, but he's giving because he got. And the grammar is unclear. For thousands of years, theologians have gotten their shorts in a knot about this problem. The problem is how much of our behavior and the outcomes of our behavior depend on our attitude and us, and how much simply depend on God. And they have argued about it for 2,000 years. What was his motive? What was his reason? Literally, Jesus says about him that salvation has come to this house today because even this one is a son of Abraham, this one who you disregarded. He already was a son of Abraham. But we don't know. We don't know why. Do you know why you're generous? Can you discern your own motives to the point where you can say, I know why I did this. I did this because of this one reason. Or I did it because of this, and maybe it was a little of this. Who of us can say that there's not multiple reasons why? So maybe it's because we think we can help, but we also know that we're supposed to, or we ought to, or maybe we feel guilty. None of us can parse out our motives with 100% certainty, and we certainly don't know why Zacchaeus did what he did. But we do know why Jesus was there. We know exactly why he was there. The last verse of this story in Luke chapter 19, verse 10, seems like a non sequitur. It seems out of place. Seems like it was added just for clarity, but I can see him saying this. After he says that Zacchaeus is a true son of Abraham, he says, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save those who are lost. He's explaining why he is generous. He's explaining why he is there. Because the Son of Man has come to seek and save not those who know they are lost. You see, Jesus is completely unapologetic about the reason for his life. He's completely unapologetic about his mission. His mission is, if you are lost, I will find you. Because that's why I'm here. Why is God generous to us? Why is God gracious? Why is God merciful? Why is God loving? There isn't an answer why. There is no why. It's because that's who God is. God is a generous and loving and merciful God. It is the Tao. It is the truth behind all things. It is not why is God generous. It is God is generous because that's who God is. And when we are generous, we are entering into the image of God. Regardless of the reason, regardless of the rationale, regardless of the motive or the attitude or the why. When we step into generosity, we are stepping into the place where we are the people God intended us to be. We live on this earth to be generous. It is our purpose. It is our reason. Our reason is to be in the image of God, and God is a generous God. It's not a question of motive. In the Tao, motive means nothing, and motive means everything. In the Tao, our motive is all that matters. And in the Tao, our motive doesn't matter at all. We are fashioned in the image of God. And when we are generous, we are stepping into that image. We are stepping into our true self. We don't know why Zacchaeus did what he did. Did Zacchaeus give so that he might get? Or did he give because he had gotten? Was he motivated by what might come back to him, or was he motivated by what he had already received? Why are we generous? Why was he generous? Why did he climb that tree? Did he look like Danny DeVito, actually? I like to think that he did. I mean, that's a perfect indication of how Zacchaeus looked, is Danny DeVito. I just can picture it. But we don't know. We don't know if he looked like Danny DeVito. We don't know why he climbed in that tree. We don't know why he gave away 3/4 of his wealth. We only know that that was what he was fashioned to do. It's what we are fashioned to do. It is why we exist. We exist in the Tao. Not because we like it, not because we're motivated by it, not because we feel good about it, but because it's who we are made to be. God has made us to be generous people. So were my parents wrong when they encouraged me to have a decent attitude, to understand why I was doing things? No, they were exactly right. Pragmatically, who of us wants to hang out with people who are always complaining and always bitter and always annoying? They knew what we all know. It's not going to serve your life well if you're always bitter and complaining and griping about things. You're going to do much better in life with a good attitude, with a positive outlook. If you can understand why you're doing things, it's going to serve you well. But there is no why in the Tao. The Tao is right, even if we don't believe it or feel it or aren't motivated by it. And the Tao calls us to generosity. It is the Tao of Jesus. That's what makes the little story of Zacchaeus so profound. That little song about Zacchaeus was a wee little man. And maybe you don't see how profound that song is, so I've asked the genius that is Casey McPherson to share his gifts with us and give us, let's just say, a generous rendition of Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Would you welcome our own Casey McPherson?
So, as Dave says, intention means everything and it means nothing. So, I'm going to do what I always do and take myself way too seriously with this song. Okay. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord wanted to see. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, Lord wanted to see. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, Lord wanted to see. Zacchaeus, when the Savior passed that way, he looked up in the tree. He said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. Going to your house today. Going to your house today. For I'm going to your house today. For I'm going to your house today. Going to your house today.